I never imagined one excuse would end with divorce papers delivered to my door, yet that is exactly what happened. After my husband uncovered the truth, I thought I could hide forever. My name is Evadne Morel. I am 31 years old, and I work as a dental hygienist, spending long days surrounded by people who rarely question me because I know how to smile and deflect. My husband Lucas is 35, a software developer who has always been steady, calm, and predictable, which made me believe I could bend the truth without real consequences. We have 2 children, Nia, who is 8 and notices everything even when I wish she would not, and Colin, who is 5 and clings to his father in ways that sometimes make me feel excluded. When I started spending time again with my ex, Damon Cross, I told myself it was harmless nostalgia, and when I stayed the night at his apartment, I convinced myself the excuse of being too tired to drive home would be enough to silence questions. Lucas asked where I had been, and I laughed, telling him he was overreacting, because I believed his quiet nature meant he would never act against me. My parents Victor and Alara supported me as usual, saying safety came first, while my sister Calla told me I was reckless and disrespectful, but I ignored her because I thought I had everything under control. Lucas's mother Ruth had warned him for years that I treated him badly, and I brushed it off with arrogance, believing he would never listen. What I failed to see was that Lucas's silence was not surrender anymore. It was preparation, and while I continued spinning stories, he was already building the case that would take everything from me. The night I opened the envelope from his lawyer, heavy with signatures and stamps, I realized too late that my excuse had cost me my marriage, my stability, and the family I believed would never leave. After the papers arrived, I sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the bold letters spelling my name, because even though I had always mocked Lucas for being too gentle, I never believed he would take such a step. My hands shook as I turned the pages, each one stamped with legal markings that made the decision feel heavier than anything I could laugh away. For years I had convinced myself that if I smiled, cried at the right moments, and told him he was overreacting, he would fold the way he always had. I told myself his calmness was weakness, his silence was fear, and that my excuses would keep me safe. But as I looked at the documents, I realized he had been silent not from fear, but from planning. I tried to call my parents and told them Lucas was destroying the family, and my mother Alara said he was being too harsh, while my father Victor muttered that men sometimes act out when pressured, but even their voices carried hesitation, because they knew deep down I had crossed a line. My sister Calla did not answer my calls at all, and when I sent her a message, she replied that she could not defend me anymore, and her words stung worse than silence because I knew she had always been my harshest but most loyal critic. Ruth, Lucas's mother, came to the house later that evening and looked at me with eyes so firm that I felt small in her presence, and she told me calmly that she had warned me for years that mocking her son would one day come back on me. I tried to defend myself by saying I had only stayed at Damon's because it was safer than driving home tired, but even I heard how ridiculous it sounded when spoken aloud, and the look on her face told me she was finished with me entirely. Lucas moved through the house that night with quiet precision, helping Colin into his pajamas, listening to Nia's stories about school, and avoiding me completely, and the sight of him carrying both children upstairs without once glancing at me made my throat tighten. I told myself he was acting dramatic, but the truth was clear in the way the children leaned against him, as if he were the only steady anchor they had left. Nia had already stopped asking me to check her homework, and Colin followed his father everywhere, refusing even to sit near me at the dinner table. I felt a strange mix of anger and fear, because I wanted to shout that they were being unfair, yet I also knew they had felt the tension long before me, and their loyalty had quietly shifted away. At work the next day, Damon acted distant, offering little more than a shrug when I told him about the papers, and I realized with dread that he had no intention of standing beside me now that consequences had arrived. I told myself I had only gone back to him for comfort, that I never intended it to mean anything permanent. But now the very man who had lured me into this spiral was stepping aside, leaving me to face the storm alone. Lucas, however, remained calm, never raising his voice, never throwing accusations, simply moving forward step by step with a determination I had never seen before. He met with his lawyer, sorted through documents in his study, and refused to be drawn into arguments no matter how hard I tried, and his silence became unbearable because it no longer gave me room to twist the story. My parents begged him to reconsider, saying every marriage has mistakes, but Lucas told them simply that evidence spoke louder than excuses. And I watched my father fall silent while my mother wept quietly beside him. Calla refused to come to the house at all, and Ruth stood proudly at her son's side, praising him for finally standing up for himself, while I sat alone, feeling the walls close in. That night, I picked up the papers again and realized they were not just threats. They were the end of a life I thought was secure. And for the first time, I admitted to myself that my excuses could no longer save me. The weeks after receiving the papers felt like moving through quicksand, because every time I tried to regain control, the ground shifted beneath me, and I realized Lucas was always one step ahead. I thought if I stayed calm and kept repeating my excuse, people would eventually believe me. But the more I spoke, the weaker my words sounded, even to myself. I told Lucas again that it had been too late to drive home, that sleeping at Damon's place was practical, that nothing happened, and that he was ruining our family over nothing, but he no longer argued. He simply nodded, almost politely, and went back to packing Nia's school lunch or helping Colin with his toys. And I hated how invisible I had become in my own home. Nia avoided me now, answering in short sentences if I tried to talk, and she always saved her longer stories for Lucas, leaning on him with trust I could no longer reach. Colin would run straight to him after school, clinging tightly and refusing even to hug me when I bent down to greet him, and I felt a sting every time, though I told myself they were just confused. My parents tried to visit more often, insisting to Lucas that children need their mother, but Ruth was always nearby, reminding them sharply that children also need honesty, and her words cut me more than any argument. Calla came once, only to tell me to stop humiliating myself with excuses, and when I snapped back that she had no right to judge, she left without another word, slamming the door as though she was done with me forever. Damon stopped calling altogether, and at work he avoided me in the hallways, speaking only about business if we crossed paths, and I felt a pit in my stomach realizing that he had already abandoned me. Lucas, on the other hand, was meeting with his lawyer regularly, carrying folders filled with receipts, phone records, and even printed copies of messages, and though he never showed me the contents, I knew exactly what they were. I once peeked when he left the study unlocked, and I saw a timeline of dates and times matched with expenses, and even a witness statement from a friend who had seen me with Damon at a cafe. I slammed the folder shut and told myself it was pathetic, that he was blowing everything out of proportion, but my hands shook so badly that I could not hold a glass afterward. At night, I tried to provoke him, telling him he was cold, distant, and destroying the children's sense of family, but he simply tucked them into bed and sat silently with them until they slept, leaving me pacing in the kitchen with no one to fight. My mother kept saying he would cool down, that time would soften his anger, but I knew deep down that this was not anger anymore. It was something stronger, something final. One evening, a courier returned with more documents, including financial statements and custody proposals. And when I opened them, I felt the air leave my lungs, because Lucas was no longer just threatening, he was acting. The next morning, Nia refused to eat breakfast with me, sitting instead at the table only when Lucas placed food in front of her, and Colin hid behind his father's leg when I tried to hug him. I wanted to scream that they were ungrateful, but the truth was in their eyes, because they had already judged me quietly, and their verdict matched their father's. I told myself I could still spin the story in court, but every night I remembered the folder in Lucas's study, the receipts, the statements, the photo, and I felt the fear of knowing there was no joke, no excuse, no gaslighting left that could undo what I had done. The day of the family dinner at the restaurant was when everything began unraveling in public, because I could not resist making another joke at Lucas's expense, thinking it would make me look witty and relaxed. We sat at a long table with my parents, Calla, Ruth, and a few cousins, and the conversation turned light until someone asked about Damon, remembering he had once dated me. I smirked and said Damon still knew me better than Lucas ever would, and I thought it was a harmless comment. But the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush me. My father Victor tried to laugh nervously and change the subject. My mother Alara said I was being playful, and I leaned back smugly, as if I had proven I was still desirable. Ruth looked horrified, staring at her son with sympathy, while Calla pushed her chair back and muttered that I was embarrassing myself before storming out of the restaurant. Lucas did not say a word. He only put his napkin on the table and excused himself quietly, leaving me surrounded by faces that no longer carried amusement. I told the table he was sulking and dramatic, but I could feel the judgment in their eyes, even from my own parents who had always defended me. Later that night, I accused him of making me look bad by walking out, but he only stared at me with that steady calm that had started to terrify me. And then he went upstairs to check on the children. I paced the living room fuming, telling myself he would eventually apologize for overreacting. But when I peeked into the children's room, I saw Nia curled against him, whispering quietly while Colin clung to his arm. I told myself they were only siding with him temporarily, but deep down I feared that their trust in me had cracked beyond repair. Over the next week, Lucas grew even quieter, writing notes in his study and avoiding conversation, while I doubled down on excuses, telling him he was paranoid and telling others he was too insecure. Damon barely responded to my messages anymore, and at work he avoided me entirely, which made me feel exposed, because I realized he would not protect me if Lucas confronted him. My mother told me to stop making comments that humiliated Lucas, and my father muttered that I should keep family matters private, but their tone carried disappointment I had never heard before. Ruth encouraged Lucas to protect himself, and Calla refused to speak to me at all, leaving me isolated from every direction. One night I entered his study when he forgot to lock it, and I saw the folder again, thicker than before, filled with bank statements, text transcripts, and even a printed copy of the restaurant bill from the night I stayed out. There were also notes of witness accounts, and even a printed photo showing me and Damon leaving a cafe together, our heads close enough to erase any doubts. My stomach dropped, but instead of admitting fear, I slammed the drawer and told myself he would never actually use it, that he loved his peace too much. But the truth was written clearly in his face when he handed me another sealed envelope days later, this time filled with custody filings and financial protections, and I realized with dread that he was not bluffing anymore. He was building the ending I had mocked into existence. The night after I found the custody filings, I tried every trick I knew, because I could not accept that Lucas had truly turned against me. Yet nothing I said made the slightest difference. I told him he was tearing our family apart for no reason, that he was letting his mother and my sister poison him, that our children would grow up broken if he carried through with the divorce. He stood calm at the kitchen counter, pouring Nia a glass of milk, and said nothing, while she watched me with wary eyes that told me she did not believe my words. Colin clung to his father's leg, refusing even to reach for me when I opened my arms, and I felt a sharp sting, realizing that I no longer had their trust. My parents came by and begged him to reconsider, my mother insisting that marriages survive worse, and my father muttering that children should not lose their mother. But Lucas only nodded politely and pointed to the folder of evidence on the table. He said the papers spoke louder than any excuse, and when he walked out of the room with the children, even my parents could not reply, because they had seen what was inside. My sister Calla sent me one short message that night, telling me I had pushed too far, and she could not watch me self-destruct anymore, and I threw the phone across the room in frustration. Ruth arrived the next morning, bringing groceries and quietly hugging her son, while giving me a look that made my skin crawl, because she had warned me for years, and now she was watching her warnings come true. Damon remained silent, ignoring every call and message, and I finally admitted to myself that he had only been interested in the thrill, never in the aftermath. I thought about the night I stayed at his apartment and told Lucas it was too late to drive home, and I realized how weak that excuse sounded now that it was written in a legal filing as part of my betrayal. The day of the hearing came quickly, faster than I could prepare, and I walked into the courthouse with shaking hands, trying to convince myself I could still spin the story. My parents sat behind me looking pale, while Calla stayed away completely, refusing to lend even silent support. Across the aisle, Ruth sat proudly with Lucas, and the sight of my children holding his hands without hesitation made my chest ache. When it was my turn to speak, I said I had only made poor choices, that staying with Damon had been harmless, that Lucas had exaggerated everything, but my words sounded brittle and empty. His lawyer presented the folder of evidence piece by piece, the messages, the receipts, the photo of me with Damon, and each item struck like a hammer against my defenses. I tried to argue, I tried to laugh, I tried to cry, but nothing could erase the proof, and the judge's expression told me my excuses meant nothing anymore. When the ruling came down, granting Lucas custody protections and financial stability, I felt the final door slam shut, and I knew I had lost not only my marriage, but the family I had assumed would always forgive me. Walking into the courtroom that morning felt like stepping into a place where every wall pressed in on me, because I could already sense that nothing I said would outweigh the pile of evidence Lucas carried under his arm. He entered with Nia holding one hand and Colin holding the other, and the sight of both children leaning so naturally against him nearly broke me before the judge even spoke. My parents sat behind me, my mother whispering that I should stay calm, while my father stared at the floor, his silence louder than any advice. Across the aisle, Ruth sat upright with her chin high, proud of her son, and when our eyes met, I saw no malice there, only the certainty of someone who had warned me all along. I told myself I could still turn this, that if I played the victim, people might believe Lucas was overreacting. But as soon as his lawyer began speaking, I realized how hopeless my position really was. The folder was opened, and page after page was laid out, beginning with credit card receipts showing nights I'd claimed to be working late, matched with transactions at restaurants near Damon's apartment. Then came the phone records, with time-stamped messages that showed Damon and I exchanging words long past midnight, even on nights when I had told Lucas I was home early and tired. My stomach twisted when the lawyer produced a printed photo from a social media post showing Damon and me at a cafe, leaning close together, my hand on his sleeve in a way that could not be explained away as friendly. I tried to laugh softly and say it was harmless, but my voice cracked, and the judge's expression told me I was only digging myself deeper. Witness statements followed, including one from a family friend who had spotted me outside Damon's building, and another from a colleague who recalled how often I disappeared during office lunches. By then, I could barely lift my head because each piece of evidence struck against me like a hammer, shattering the flimsy excuses I had prepared. When it was my turn to speak, I claimed again that it had been too late to drive home that night, that sleeping at Damon's had been practical, that nothing beyond that happened, but even I heard how weak those words sounded in the heavy silence of the courtroom. I tried to insist Lucas was letting paranoia guide him, that his father had pushed him, that Ruth had poisoned him against me, but the steady calm on his face told me none of it mattered anymore. The children sat quietly with him, Clara leaning against his arm, and Colin nestled in his lap, and I realized with sick clarity that they had already chosen their side long before the judge gave a ruling. My mother wept quietly behind me, whispering that I was still her daughter, but even she did not defend my story, while my father shook his head slowly, ashamed to be seen. Calla had not even come, which stung more than any words, because it meant she could not watch me fall apart after warning me so many times. Ruth placed a hand gently on Lucas's shoulder, and I hated the pride in her eyes, yet I knew she had every right to feel it, because he had carried himself with dignity while I mocked him. When the judge finally spoke, the words felt like a final door slamming shut. Custody protections for Lucas, financial safeguards for him, and the dissolution of our marriage on the grounds of betrayal proven by evidence. I wanted to scream that it was unfair, that families should not end over one mistake, that jokes and excuses should not cost everything, but I stayed silent because I could see that no one in the room believed me anymore. Nia kept her eyes down, refusing to meet mine, and Colin clung tighter to his father's shirt, and in that moment, I understood that their quiet judgment cut deeper than the legal ruling itself. My parents left the courtroom with their heads bowed. Ruth walked out proudly with her son and grandchildren, and I remained sitting alone on the bench, unable to move, because I knew that the silence I once mocked had become the blade that severed my family from me. That night I sat at the kitchen table again, the house eerily quiet, staring at the signed documents spread in front of me, and I realized there was nothing left to fight for. Damon had vanished, my children had turned to Lucas, my sister had abandoned me, my parents were too ashamed to argue, and my husband had proven me wrong in the one way I never expected, not through anger or force, but through patience, evidence, and silence. I had laughed at him for being too calm. I had mocked him for overreacting. I had dismissed his suspicions with arrogance, and in the end, those very things became his greatest strengths. The calmness that I saw as weakness had been his shield, the silence that I saw as surrender had been his weapon, and the patience that I despised had been the steady path leading him to victory. I looked around the empty house and felt the weight of every joke, every excuse, every gaslight I had thrown at him, because they had not only broken my marriage, they had stripped me of my children's trust and left me standing in ruins I could not rebuild. And in that silence, I finally admitted the truth to myself. Lucas had won, not by fighting louder, but by standing steady until my own lies destroyed me. Leaving the courthouse should have felt like freedom, but instead it felt like exile, because I walked out alone, while Lucas left through the other door with both children pressed close to him, their little hands gripping his as if they belonged nowhere else. I wanted to run after them, to remind them that I was still their mother. But my legs felt heavy, and I already knew that they would not look back even if I called. Ruth walked proudly beside her son, her hand on his arm, and though I despised the look of satisfaction on her face, I also knew she had every reason to feel vindicated, because she had warned me from the beginning. My parents followed me silently to the car, my mother whispering that perhaps appeals were possible, though even she sounded unconvinced, while my father said nothing at all, his eyes fixed forward as if he could not bear to see me. At home, I collapsed at the kitchen table, staring at the stamped documents that declared my marriage dissolved, my custody reduced, and my stability shattered, and I kept asking myself how I had allowed one excuse to grow into such destruction. I thought about the night I stayed at Damon's, the way I had so casually told Lucas it was too late to drive, and I realized now how insulting those words must have sounded to a man who had trusted me for years. I told myself at the time that it was harmless, that Lucas was overreacting, that I was still in control, but sitting in the silence of that empty kitchen, I knew that excuse had been the spark that set fire to everything. Nia's drawings were still pinned to the refrigerator, bright colors showing a family that no longer existed, and Colin's toy cars were lined neatly along the window ledge, abandoned, waiting for a boy who would now play with them in another house. I tried to tell myself that children forgive quickly, that they would miss me, but I remembered their faces in court, the way they leaned into their father and away from me, and I knew their hearts had already made a choice. Damon had long since disappeared, no messages, no calls, no presence at all, and I felt the bitterness of knowing I had risked everything for someone who never planned to stand beside me when things fell apart. My sister Calla would not return my calls, and when I sent her a long message begging her to believe I was misunderstood, she only replied with one sentence telling me I had chosen my own path. My parents remained polite but distant, visiting less often, and I could see the shame in their faces every time they looked at me, as though they wanted to defend me but knew they could not. Lucas, meanwhile, moved forward with quiet strength, settling the children into their new routines, handling finances with precision, and never once gloating or speaking ill of me, which somehow made the loss even harder to bear. Because if he had shouted, if he had cursed, if he had shown bitterness, I could have told myself he was cruel, but his calmness left me with no shield, only the truth that I had mocked him into becoming the victor. I thought back to every moment I laughed at his jealousy, every dinner where I humiliated him with casual remarks, every night I told him he was paranoid while sneaking messages to Damon, and I realized that each one had been a stone I laid on the path leading to this moment. I had built my own downfall step by step, blind to the fact that he was watching, waiting, and quietly collecting every piece of proof he needed. The silence that once annoyed me now echoed louder than any argument, because it was the silence of a man who no longer needed words, only actions, and those actions had left me stripped of everything I thought I controlled. I poured a glass of wine and stared again at the papers, the official seals, the signatures, the finality, and I admitted for the first time that there was no more story to spin, no more gaslighting to attempt, no more excuses to offer. Lucas had ended our marriage not with anger but with evidence, not with cruelty but with clarity, and the children had followed him because they saw what I refused to see. The calmness I called weakness had been his greatest strength, and my arrogance had been the rope I tied around myself until he simply pulled it tight. And now, sitting in the quiet house, I finally understood that my laughter, my excuses, and my lies had not protected me. They had destroyed me, leaving nothing but the echo of what I had thrown away. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.